My name is Thea Bennett, and I'm 33 years old. 3 days before Christmas, I dragged myself home after a brutal 12-hour shift at the hospital, only to realize my house key no longer worked. I stood on the front porch of the home I grew up in, jiggling the lock over and over, thinking maybe it was just some weird glitch or a simple mistake. But nope, it wasn't. Through the frosted glass panel beside the front door, I could make out my mother's silhouette moving around in the kitchen, completely unbothered, like she couldn't hear me knocking at all. I knocked again, even louder this time. My knuckles turned bright red from the freezing cold. Finally, my father cracked the door open just enough to shove 2 black garbage bags onto the porch before saying 4 words that I'll never forget for as long as I live. "You don't live here." Those bags held all my clothes, not folded, not packed with even the slightest bit of care, just crammed into black plastic like yesterday's trash waiting to be hauled away. My winter coat was stuffed in there too. The good one. The one I'd bought with my very first real paycheck after becoming a nurse. My father didn't stick around for any kind of conversation. He simply shut the door, and a second later I heard the deadbolt click into place. I want to explain how everything got to this point because, honestly, none of it happened overnight. My parents, Richard and Colleen Bennett, had spent the previous 2 years slowly pulling away from me ever since I refused to hand over the small inheritance my grandmother left me when I turned 30. It wasn't some massive fortune, just $60,000 sitting safely in an account my grandmother created before she passed away. My father wanted to use that money for what he kept calling family investments. I wanted it to stay exactly where it was, untouched. Something about the way he asked never felt like an actual request. It felt more like he believed he was already entitled to it. The moment I said no, everything inside that house shifted. Family dinners became shorter and painfully quiet. Phone calls suddenly stopped getting returned. Conversations turned cold. And now, just 3 days before Christmas, I was standing outside in 17-degree weather holding 2 garbage bags filled with my own belongings, while my parents acted like I was nothing more than a stranger standing on their porch. The first person I called was my older brother, Grant. He never answered. Then I called my best friend from nursing school, Priyanka. She was already 30,000 feet in the air on a flight to Ohio to spend Christmas with her in-laws, so there wasn't much she could do except send me a stream of panicked text messages asking if I was okay. I sat in my car in the driveway for nearly an hour with the heater running, trying to figure out where in the world I could go. My apartment lease had ended just 2 weeks earlier. I'd been staying with my parents temporarily while searching for a new place, which suddenly felt like the cruelest irony imaginable. Every hotel near downtown was either completely booked for the holidays or charging rates that made my stomach drop the second I looked at my already strained bank balance. A major car repair the month before had already taken a pretty serious bite out of my savings. By 9 o'clock that night, with the snowfall getting heavier by the minute, I found myself parked outside a modest building with a hand-painted sign that read, Grace Street Shelter. I'd driven past that building hundreds of times throughout my life. Not once, not even for a second, did I ever imagine I'd actually walk through those doors. But that night, I did. I carried my 2 garbage bags inside and walked past a folding table with a half-decorated plastic Christmas tree sitting on top. A volunteer named Warwick greeted me without asking a single judgmental question. No awkward looks. No attitude. No lectures. He simply handed me a blanket, gave me a cot number, and said, "Christmas Eve's just 2 days away. We'll get you settled before then." That's how I ended up spending Christmas Eve sitting on a thin cot inside a shelter gymnasium that smelled like fresh coffee and damp wool, surrounded by complete strangers who each had their own heartbreaking story about how life had brought them there. The woman on the cot beside me looked to be somewhere in her 60s. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her sharp, alert eyes stood out in a room filled with exhausted faces. I'd noticed she had been quietly watching me for a while before she finally leaned over and spoke. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Thea," I replied. "Thea Bennett." The moment she heard my last name, she froze. Completely froze. The kind of silence that happens when someone hears something they never expected to hear. Then she reached over and gripped my wrist tightly enough that I nearly pulled away. Bennett, she repeated quietly. Your grandmother was Bennett? I slowly nodded, my heartbeat suddenly pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the freezing weather outside. Your grandmother hired me, the woman whispered, her eyes filling with a mixture of grief and urgency. 10 years ago, she told me this exact thing might happen someday. She left something for you, but only if I found you here like this. She glanced around the shelter before looking back into my eyes. Homeless. She knew. She knew they would do this to you. I opened my mouth, ready to ask what she meant, how my grandmother could possibly have planned something years after her death that depended on me ending up in a homeless shelter on Christmas Eve. But before I could say a single word, a security guard called the woman's name from across the gym. She stood almost immediately and looked back at me. Stay right here, she said. I'll be back in just a minute. There's something I've been holding on to for 10 years. A few moments later, I learned the woman's name was Bernadette Ferris. She walked back across the shelter gym, holding a worn leather satchel tightly against her chest as though it contained something too precious to risk dropping. She sat down beside me once again, carefully unzipped the satchel with slightly trembling hands, and pulled out a sealed envelope that had yellowed around the edges with age. Alongside it was a small brass key wrapped neatly inside an old handkerchief. Your grandmother came to see me in the spring before she passed away, Bernadette began quietly. She didn't trust your parents. There wasn't a hint of hesitation in her voice. She told me straight up, Richard has a gambling problem, and Colleen has spent 30 years covering for him. Bernadette paused for a second before continuing. She believed that if anything ever happened to her, they'd eventually find a way to take everything, including you, if you let them get close enough. My stomach tightened. Everything she was saying sounded unbelievable. And yet, deep down, it also made a terrifying amount of sense. Bernadette gently placed the envelope into my hands. She paid me every single year for the last 10 years just to keep this safe, she explained. And she asked me to keep watching. She told me that if you ever ended up truly out of options, not just struggling financially, but completely without a place to go, that would be the moment I'd know they had finally shown you who they really were. That's when I was supposed to find you and give you this. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter from my grandmother. Tucked behind it was a folded legal document from a law office located in the neighboring county. Even before reading a single line, my hands had already started shaking. The letter explained everything. Years before she passed away, my grandmother had quietly purchased a modest little house on Larkspur Lane through a separate trust. Nobody in my family knew it existed. Not my father. Not my mother. No one. The deed had been placed entirely in my name. The letter also explained that she'd created another account containing an additional $40,000. The money was being held by the very same law firm and would only be released after Bernadette confirmed that she'd found me living in a homeless shelter or in another situation where I had truly been displaced. My grandmother had built every safeguard she could think of. She hadn't simply hoped I'd be okay. She had planned for the worst. Then I reached the part of the letter that completely shattered me. If you're reading this from a place like this, then they did exactly what I feared they would. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you while I was still here. So let this protect you now. I couldn't stop the tears anymore. They rolled down my face before I even realized I was crying. I sat there on that thin shelter cot while snow continued falling outside the gymnasium windows, holding undeniable proof that my grandmother had understood my parents far better than I ever had. For years, I'd kept making excuses for them. She never did. Bernadette rested a comforting hand on my shoulder. The law office, Whitfield and Cross, will reopen the day after Christmas, she said gently. I've already documented every yearly check-in your grandmother asked me to make. If anyone ever tries to challenge the trust, they'll have 10 years of records showing I followed every instruction exactly as she requested. I looked over at her, still struggling to process everything. You did all of that? For someone else's family? She smiled softly. I did it because your grandmother trusted me. She believed every person deserves someone in their corner. And she was absolutely determined that if your own family ever walked away from you, you wouldn't face it completely alone. For the first time in days. Maybe even the first time in years. I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again. Hope. Real hope. Not because my problems had magically disappeared overnight. Not because life had suddenly become easy. But because someone had loved me enough to think 10 years ahead. Someone had believed I was worth protecting long after they were gone. As Christmas Eve quietly settled over the shelter, surrounded by strangers who had become unexpectedly kind, I realized something that completely changed my perspective. The people who share your last name aren't always the ones who become your real family. Sometimes. The people who truly show up for you are the ones who simply choose to. The morning after Christmas, I called Whitfield and crossed the very minute their office opened. A friendly paralegal named Odalis answered the phone and calmly confirmed every single detail Bernadette had shared with me. Nothing had been exaggerated. Nothing had been misunderstood. Everything was exactly as my grandmother had planned. Before we ended the call, Odalis scheduled an appointment for December 26th and told me to bring identification along with the envelope and key Bernadette had given me. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across the desk from attorney Foster Whitfield. He carefully walked me through every page of the trust documents, explaining each detail line by line so there wouldn't be any confusion. The more we reviewed the paperwork, the more amazed I became. My grandmother had thought of absolutely everything. Years before her passing, she'd quietly purchased a small 2-bedroom bungalow on Larkspur Lane through a completely separate trust. The property had never been connected to my parents in any way. Their names appeared nowhere in the documents. The deed belonged entirely to me. Free and clear. No mortgage. No outstanding loans. No hidden strings attached. It was mine. Foster then explained that the additional $40,000 my grandmother had placed into the trust would be released immediately after Bernadette's decade of documented check-ins were officially verified. That process only took a few days. Within the week, the funds were deposited into my account. For the first time since standing on my parents' porch with 2 garbage bags in my hands, I finally felt like I could breathe again. During the first week of January, I moved into the little house on Larkspur Lane. It definitely wasn't perfect. The plumbing groaned every time I turned on the hot water. Paint peeled from sections of the hallway walls. The kitchen cabinets had clearly seen better days. Outside, the garden had become a tangled mess of dead branches, weeds, and years of neglect. Still, the moment I stepped inside, it felt different. The house was peaceful, quiet, safe. Most importantly, it was mine. Nobody could ever stand at that front door and tell me I didn't belong there. Before I unpacked a single box, I replaced every lock on the house. It wasn't just about security. It was about finally taking control of my own life. Every room I cleaned felt like another piece of myself coming back together. Every fresh coat of paint made the place feel a little more like home. Little by little, the bungalow stopped looking like an abandoned property and started feeling like the fresh start I desperately needed. About 3 weeks later, my parents somehow learned about the inheritance. I wasn't surprised. News always seemed to travel through extended family faster than anyone expected. One cold afternoon, there was a knock at my front door. When I opened it, my father was standing on my porch. He'd tracked down my address through one of my cousins. Without asking if he could come in, he demanded to know why my grandmother had gone behind the family's back. His tone wasn't hurt. It wasn't emotional. It was angry. Like he believed something that belonged to him had been stolen. For just a second, I looked at the man standing in front of me. A few weeks earlier, I'd been freezing outside his front door while he locked me out without a second thought. Now, our positions had completely changed. I stayed calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply looked him in the eye and said, "Grandma didn't go behind anyone's back. She protected the only person in this family who never asked her for anything." The words hung there between us. For once, he had absolutely nothing to say. No excuses. No accusations. No clever comeback. Just silence. After a long moment, I politely asked him to leave. And for the first time in my entire life, he actually did. I watched him walk back down the driveway without another word. As his car disappeared around the corner, I closed my front door, locked it, and stood there for a long moment. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood something that had taken me years to accept. Home isn't the place where people tolerate you. Home is the place where you're respected, protected, and genuinely wanted. That little bungalow wasn't fancy. It wasn't expensive. But inside those walls, I had something I'd never truly experienced before. Peace. And honestly, that was worth more than anything money could ever buy. Even now, I still find myself thinking back to that Christmas Eve in the shelter. I remember sitting on that thin little cot, wrapped in a blanket that barely kept the cold away. I remember Bernadette reaching over and gripping my wrist the moment she heard my last name. And I remember just how close I came to believing I had completely run out of hope. If I had driven somewhere else that night, if I decided not to walk through those shelter doors, if Bernadette and I had missed each other by even a few minutes, my life might have unfolded very differently. Sometimes that thought still gives me chills. What amazes me most isn't the house. It isn't the money. It isn't even the trust my grandmother quietly built all those years ago. It's the incredible amount of love and foresight behind every single decision she made. She spent an entire decade preparing for a moment she prayed would never happen. Think about that for a second. For 10 straight years, she made sure someone was watching over me, even after she was gone. She made certain there would be proof. She made certain there would be witnesses. She made certain there would be a safe place waiting for me if everything else fell apart. That wasn't just planning. That was love. The kind of love that keeps protecting someone long after a goodbye has already been said. Bernadette didn't owe me anything. She wasn't related to me. She wasn't obligated to carry that responsibility for 10 years. But she honored every promise she made to my grandmother without cutting corners or giving up. In a world where so many promises get broken, she quietly kept hers. I'll never be able to thank her enough for that. As for my parents, people sometimes ask whether we've repaired our relationship. The honest answer is, not really. Time has a way of changing people, but it doesn't erase the choices they make. Being locked out of the home where I grew up wasn't just one painful moment. It revealed something that had been building beneath the surface for years. Trust, once shattered like that, isn't something you simply piece back together overnight. Maybe one day things will be different. Maybe they won't. Either way, I've stopped allowing that question to control my life. Some chapters aren't meant to be rewritten. They're meant to teach you something before you turn the page. Instead, I've focused on building a life that reflects the values my grandmother believed in. A life filled with kindness instead of control, respect instead of entitlement, and gratitude instead of resentment. Little by little, the bungalow on Larkspur Lane became more than just a house. I repaired the old plumbing. I painted every room. I brought the neglected garden back to life one season at a time. Every flower that bloomed outside felt like a quiet reminder that healing doesn't happen all at once. It grows slowly, one small step after another. Sometimes I'll sit on the front porch with a cup of coffee early in the morning before work, watching the sunlight spill across the yard. Those are the moments when I feel closest to my grandmother. Not because I can somehow hear her voice, but because I know every bit of peace surrounding me exists because she cared enough to protect my future. She couldn't stop me from experiencing heartbreak. She couldn't prevent people from disappointing me. But she made sure disappointment wouldn't be the end of my story. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see while I was standing outside my parents' house holding those 2 garbage bags. Being rejected by the wrong people can sometimes lead you exactly where you were always meant to be. Losing one home made room for me to find another. And this time, it was built on love instead of obligation. So whenever someone tells me that family is everything, I always think of my grandmother. Because she taught me a different lesson. Real family isn't defined by who shares your last name. It's defined by who stands beside you when your world falls apart. My grandmother saw that moment coming long before I ever did. And, because of her, even at the absolute lowest point of my life, I never truly hit the ground. She made sure there would always be something solid waiting to catch me. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. And it's one I'll carry with me for the rest of my life.